If you take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm either going to have way too much time or not near enough, so depends on how fast I talk. So unfortunately for y'all, I'm not Daniel. I told him I wanted to help teach a class, and he said, well, I'm going to be out of town a couple weeks. You want to teach my class for me? I said, what's the class? And he said, Revelations. And I said, I don't really want to teach that. And then he texted me about a day later, maybe 2 days, and he said, but for real, if you want to teach, I'll give you help and whatnot. And I said, well, I'm up for a challenge, so I'll give it a shot. So maybe this goes good. He said there's another opportunity later in the quarter. So if it goes good, you might see me again. If not, someone else will teach for him. So as Daniel does every class, we'll quickly review what is the genre of the book of Revelation. All the above. And we're going to cruise through them like Daniel does. What are some characteristics of apocalyptic literature? Just yell it out. A, C, and D. Yes, thank you. And what's the first question to ask in Bible study? Correct. What does it mean to the readers? And that's going to be particularly important today as we go through the letters to the church. What was the challenges facing the first century Christians of Asia? A, B, and C, right? Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so we're going to dive headfirst into it, and I'm not really great with PowerPoint. I've made 2 PowerPoints in the past 10 years, so you just get to see all my notes up there. So first thing, we're going to review the historical situation of the churches and of John. I think Daniel talked a little bit about this on Wednesday, and we've kind of been throughout the past couple classes. But John wrote this book. It's widely believed that he is in exile in Patmos for his teachings. So he, at the beginning of the book, says, I, your brother, in persecution and such, reaching out to you to write to y'all. And part of the reason he is in exile is way back. The whole area was taken over, turned Greek by, I believe it was Alexander the Great. And that was during what they call the Intertestament years. And basically Greek culture took over. When you think about Greek culture, you think specifically about maybe mythology, their pagan gods and such, Zeus and things along those lines. So that culture became very, very prevalent in that society. And so then as the time goes, we get closer to the time of the writing of Revelations. The Roman Empire has taken control of the region, but for the most part, they've adopted Greek culture, maybe changed some of the names of the gods so that it's their god, but they're generally the same. They've adopted the philosophy and of the Greek culture as well, while introducing their own different things, such as the worship of the emperors, which is a big factor at this time. So one big thing about this time is that with it being a largely pagan society, some really big tenets of pagan worship are idol worship and sexual immorality. So we'll see that crop up a few times during the letters to the churches. One other interesting thing is that when the Roman culture or Roman society came in, Jews were actually allowed to, they got an exemption from having to follow the Roman traditions and the Roman laws when it came to religion. They were grandfathered in as an old religion, as long as they didn't really kind of push the boundaries too much, say by preaching or pushing their beliefs. And so while they were exempt from all this, there was a period of time where the Christians fell under this category as well. Christianity for a long time was seen as a sect of Judaism in the eyes of the Roman government. But it became apparent that they were not the same at some point, and Christians began to take heat from all directions. They took heat from the Roman society, and they took heat from the Jews, because in an effort to keep the heat off themselves, the Jews were like, hey, look at these guys over here, look at what they're doing. So this is kind of where we're at. It's just a really tough time for the Christians. Sorry, like I said, I'm not used to PowerPoint. Before we dive into it, just a real quick review of the vision from chapter 1. We had the vision that John saw with the 7 golden lampposts and the Son of Man among the lampposts, dressed in a robe and a gold sash, and he had white hair and blazing eyes, feet like bronze glowing in a furnace, a loud booming voice of rushing waters. And in his right hand he had the 7 stars and the double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. Just really, I believe on Wednesday we talked about what your emotions were behind hearing that and trying to understand what John was saying at that time. So just really an incredible scene. As he said he fell on his face, I believe, and he thought he was dead. So that's pretty impactful. I don't know if anyone's ever kind of had a scenario like that in their life where they thought they were dead, but probably pretty impactful. So, and then jumping into the letters, we talked a little bit about this on Wednesday, but every letter, each one of the 7 has a uniform structure, and I stole this straight from Daniel's PowerPoint, so I know it's right. It says, each letter starts out, it says, Jesus is, and he gives a description from the first chapter. What's interesting, and we might hit on it on a couple of letters, that the description that was given to the church a lot of times had some sort of reference to the area that they lived in. And like I said, if I remember and I have the time, we can point some of those out as we go through. And then it says Jesus knows. He tells them their situation, whether they're being persecuted, what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong. There's a couple churches that he had nothing good to say about, but there were a couple churches that he only had good things to say about. So Jesus knows. And then after that, he gives his comfort or his challenge. For those that were doing good, that needed encouragement, well, for all churches, actually, he gave comfort, but he also said, if you don't turn, I will do this. That gets on to Jesus' will, the promise that he will deliver those and he will punish those who are not following his word. And then finally at the end of every letter, he says, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So, in the interest of not really having enough time to go through each letter, we're going to focus on what Daniel's 3 topics of the challenges that the church has faced, being persecution, conformity or compromise was his exact word, and apathy. So instead of going through and studying every single church, we're going to look at it in the lens of those topics and try to place the churches into those topics, or those categories, and we'll go from there and discuss. So the first challenge, and this is the one that I chose to speak about, and then I'll get y'all's opinion after this, would be persecution. And the second church, the second letter, was the church of Smyrna, and they are considered, if your Bible has not headlines, but those sectional titles, they are considered the persecuted church. So they, much like all the other areas, are in a city that has long-standing loyalty to Rome, and the imperial cult or worship of the emperor is well established. And there's also a large Jewish population in that city. But they, as we discussed, are grandfathered from the old to practice their things. And they, so just like we talked about from just kind of the overview, this church is being subject to that specifically. It should be noted that this is one of the churches that just said that did not have any rebuke, but they were said to be always under hardship. And so their letter was mostly encouragement. So one thing that he notes in this, that John notes in this, is that you have blasphemy from those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And this synagogue of Satan is a widely kind of talked about comment. Some people are saying, oh, he's calling the Jews Satan. And actually, that's not really what they mean, but he is referring to this as he's using the Jews, Satan is using the Jews to root out God's people. In this specific scenario, the Jews are going through and accusing the church of Smyrna of all sorts of wickedness, and that is what gets the Christians into where the Roman culture themselves is persecuting the Christians as well. So we go through the letter, and I'm hoping that everyone has read it, because we're not going to read it. But he goes through in the standard structure, and he says that he knows their tribulations, he knows their poverty, but he tells them that they are rich. So even though they are poor, and that is something that we'll see repeated out throughout the churches, is that as Christians, when they don't participate in the pagan worship, the pagan culture, the imperial culture, that it's really hard to advance in life. It's hard to keep a job. It's hard to flourish in society. And I think we could probably see that in our own lives, that sometimes the choices we make and how to live our life as a Christian can have impacts in your work life, in your life with relationships outside of church. But as he does in all the letters, he encourages them, and he tells them to be faithful unto death, and he'll give them a crown of life. And then ends with, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. In the time of persecution, the Christians know that people have been killed for their beliefs. And so that is definitely a fear that these first century churches had, was the fear of death for their beliefs. And so this is pretty impactful to them in the sense that, yes, you may die, but my followers, Jesus's believers, God's followers, will not suffer the second death in the sense of eternal life. So, any questions on Smyrna? Anyone want to make a comment on Smyrna? Yes, sir, Brian.
I would just make one comment as you look into all the letters. There's one recurring word that's part of the promise, and it says, he who overcomes. So he's advising every church, and he's advising us as we face the tribulations and hardships and temptations in our life. He who overcomes will receive the crown of life. Mm-hmm. So endure, persevere, overcome.
Yes, sir.
I noticed in this particular section, when he talks about, I know that the Jews are causing the persecution, a lot of it, and the Roman government, as you said. But when I think about some of the wording, it describes the devil and Satan, as being ultimately the cause of that, and it's very much in line with what you read about in Job, and it's in line with what you experience in your life. Yeah. You're going to be tested. It will happen over and over again, and it's wise to look at it in that way, so that when it's happening, like, God's allowing this to happen, and the devil is testing you, and how are you going to respond to these tests? How are you going to weather the storm that you're going through, if you're going through a storm?
Yeah, exactly. Anybody else? Albert? And also, what are your thoughts about the other churches that experience persecution? We'll just kind of roll into that as well.
Well, now you changed it. First, you're doing a great job. Thanks for filling in. So we'll go easy with questions. So it's more of an observation that struck me in the last class, and I briefly touched base with Daniel. Jesus knows, and if I take a step back and I dig deeper into this, Jesus was crucified, died, witnessed. So, and then arose again, when he was on this earth as man, he knew what we felt. That was his purpose, to be able to say when he was sacrificed, he knew what we physically felt, what we thought, and how we reacted. And it just really struck me that now he's saying, I know, because he's the one that's conveying this through John, I know what you're going through, which just deepens more of Jesus is who he says he is, and the fact that they know that he was killed, physically killed, and now throughout all these 7 churches, he's expressing, I know what you're going through, and or I know what you're being tempted by. And it just really struck me, and it struck me with fear and great comfort that here I am today. Jesus knows what I'm going through and is going to provide what I need. And so it's a small rabbit hole, but it struck me at the end of the class when we say he knows. That really had a big impact on me, and I want to share it.
And he truly does know, right? Anybody else? So that second question that I presented right before Albert spoke was, what other churches of the 7 do you see as in their letter what God wrote or what John wrote to them, what he knows, what God knows? Which other churches are persecuted? And I'll make a statement, maybe this will make it easier for this one, that I believe in every letter, this is my personal opinion, that there are elements of persecution that can be seen across. And knowing the time, we know that these churches are facing persecution. That could be a cause for the problem that the letter is actually written about. So, anybody have an opinion? Ian.
Just a general comment about the observation I've seen or I've had here is it's interesting. You see, this is the church that's kind of getting it right in terms of dealing with the persecution and what that's done for their faith. You see that it specifically strengthened their faith, and I think there's maybe a nod here towards Daniel. Saying that they would be tested for 10 days and you will have tribulation. Daniel was tested for 10 days with eating he approached the chiefs and said, hey, I want to eat this for 10 days. Let's see who looks better at the end of this 10 days. And through that testing, God brought them through that and in turn gave them knowledge, and they had strengthened their faith through that. So I think there's a nod here to them in that through the tribulations that they're going through, God is encouraging them here and saying, hey, you're going to come out of this. You're not going to be hurt by your second death. You're going to come through this. Your faith is strong now. Keep it where it is. Keep your eyes on God. And I just think it's interesting here. They seem to be getting it right in more ways than they're not.
Anybody else? Okay, well then we'll just quickly go through what I had just thrown on a PowerPoint. So Philadelphia was one of the 7 churches that was hard to place into a category, because Smyrna on the one front had no rebuke, but it says, I know that you are suffering persecution. Philadelphia is considered the spiritually alive church. There's no rebuke in their letter either. But knowing things about the city of Philadelphia, in Homer Haley's study on Revelation says that there were so many temples and festivals to the pagan deities that Philadelphia was often called Little Athens. So imagine all that pagan worship, idol worship that is going on in there and trying to live as a Christian in that society. So while it's not specifically said anything about Philadelphia having anything that they're doing wrong, they're one of the ones, like I said, that wasn't rebuked. But they, like other places, are facing this. And it can be seen in the letter where he says that he refers to those, behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan, those who say they are Jews but are not, but lie. I will make them bow down at your feet. So while it doesn't specifically reference persecution, that passage is very similar to the passage where he talks about the synagogue of Satan with the church at Smyrna. So, and then that's on to the next one. Anybody have a comment on persecution, the churches and persecution? Yes, sir.
Just a thought, two of the churches, the dead church in Sardis and then the lukewarm church in Laodicea, both of those aren't mentioned as having persecution, which makes you wonder if they weren't living the right way, is that how they were avoiding persecution? Because they weren't standing out, their lights weren't shining, they weren't sowing the seed, whatever it was, but whether they were lukewarm or dead, they weren't facing persecution like the other churches that were standing firm. So that's an admonition for us too. If we're not seeing the persecution, are we standing out enough in the world today such that people notice?
I want everyone to remember that for the final piece of this class, the wrap up, we'll say. Because, like I said, I think that every church in their own form, is, like I said, personal opinion, that at some point in time they face persecution. How they responded to persecution is a direct result, how they responded is what the letter is being written about. Some churches had no rebuke, as we just discussed, but maybe a little bit of persecution. Some churches, the next one, have compromised. So Pergamum, say that 10 times fast. Pergamum is considered one of the churches that compromised. This is, like I said, if your Bible has titles at the top of a different section, this is called the worldly church. And let me flip over to it in the Bible. So the letter to Pergamum opens up like all the other ones, where he talks about the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, and he goes into telling them what he knows. And in verse 14 of chapter 2, he says, But I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teachings of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel to eat things sacrificed to the idols and to commit acts of immorality. So we have a reference here to Balaam and Balak. Does anybody know that story? You want to share it?
Yeah.
Concisely share it.
Balak, king of, I forgot which kingdom it was, anyway, wanted to keep the Israelites from coming through his land. And so he got a hold of Balaam and asked him to curse, and of course he wouldn't let him. So Balaam found a workaround, saying, if you will entice with your women the Israelites into immorality, they will fall.
Yep.
And so what we have here is whoever Nicholas was, perhaps the convert out of Acts, but they don't really know. He was apparently, if it's a teaching of Balaam, basically advocating for sexual immorality.
Yeah, and really at the sole purpose of getting them to do wrong. As you mentioned, the Nicolaitans, they're referenced a couple times in Revelations. Other than that, there's not a lot known about them. What we do know about them is it's referenced in, is it this one? There's another reference to the Nicolaitans. It was in Ephesus as well, or the church at Ephesus, where he tells them, you hate their works, and I hate their works too. So whoever they were, God and John were not. In the letter John wrote, and God's words, did not like the teachings of the Nicolaitans. So as you mentioned, that the Nicolaitans have enticed the Christians to compromise their beliefs by teaching them or convincing them to eat food sacrificed to idols. Some versions say practice sexual immorality, others say fornication. I think in this scenario, they can be used interchangeably, but also there is a large reference of fornication. The word fornication, not necessarily meaning sexual immorality, but when you are worshiping other gods, in a kind of a comparison of the act of fornication to cheating on God, in a sense. Probably a more elegant way to say that, but I can't think of it right now on the spot. So that word, if you have it in different translations, it can be seen as both ways. But the fact of the matter is that the Christians are participating in the pagan society. As we talked, that each of these societies, it's probably hard to live a life and worship God. I mean, think maybe living in China, where it's illegal. Christians have to worship in hiding. I mean, think about those types of challenges that could be, that we don't face. We don't face challenges like that. We think maybe we are persecuted in our lives, and maybe in some ways, but people are not actively seeking us out, trying to make us fall, trying to get us to shut our doors. But that was a big thing at this time. So the church at Pergamum was guilty of compromise in the sense that they were struggling to be a part of society as it was. And so when someone came by and said, hey, you can worship this way, you can do this, and you can still do your church thing, but come be a part of this, come be a part of that, and be a part of society, and now they're accepted by society. But as is written in the letter, Jesus, the letter says, therefore repent, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth. A reference to the top of the letter and Revelations 1. So those who don't repent, those who don't turn back to him, are going to face the sword of God. So, any questions, comments, thoughts on Pergamum? Yes, sir.
I'm going to stir the pot a little bit here. I building off of what Rick said, I think we don't want to gloss over the persecution. I mean, if you think about why these churches are being persecuted in the first place, it's because that the societies that they're in are in fear of their influence on that society, and it will lead to taking away of things that they want to keep. Things that in the heart of a Christian we know are wrong, that God told us specifically not to do. And so if you're living in a society and you're not imposing that fear on the people around you as a Christian, then I would argue you are making a choice to compromise. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I see that in America every day, and I'm guilty of that myself. There's things in our modern society that I've embraced that probably as a Christian I shouldn't be embracing. Or maybe I'm not embracing it, but I'm not speaking up against it, speaking out and standing up for what I know is right. There is lots and lots of challenges coming down the pike with what is right and what is wrong, with just basic morality. And it's only going to get worse with modern technologies and things that are rapidly changing the transmission of information and kind of how people are influenced. And people's minds are very easily swayed. And so as Christians, I think we need to be resolute in our beliefs, and we need to be thinking about why we're not being persecuted. Like if we're going about our daily life and people don't have issues with what we believe in, but they don't disagree with us when we're out in the world, I think we should be thinking about that. Like it's not our job to cause trouble in society, but there should be people that are affected by us being Christians on a daily basis. Sometimes it will be good, and sometimes it will be bad. But I think we should notice some sort of persecution in our lives on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. Dave?
Yeah, great comments. I'm fascinated studying this as, it's a historical text. of these people who lived 2,000 years ago, and here the church is in its infancy, and these are saved souls that were baptized into Jesus Christ and were added to the church. And yet we see how in the church's infancy, and really that's an unnecessary caveat because churches throughout time, there's been members of that body who have suffered, every member has suffered from sin. But imagine today a pocket of Bel Air Church of Christ that was engaged in sexual immorality and idolatry. But the wisdom that I glean from this is how it's handled, how Jesus speaks to this church in calling it out. I think to Ian's point about modern society, the devil is intricately at work in very deceitful ways and tries to set the narrative of how we address these things. And one of the things he's done so skillfully, even with Christians, is to conflate the meaning of tolerance and acceptance and to basically render us incapacitated in our ability to righteously serve God in the manner he dictated. How is it addressed here? With love. But verse 16 says, "Therefore repent, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth." And so there is a direct rebuke and then a promise. And I feel like we need to approach these things in a similar manner. Don't waver on our beliefs, like Ian said. In this time, it is more important. We cannot be a church of cowards, a term that I did not coin. It's a book written. We cannot be a church of cowards, of tolerance and acceptance in the name of being nice, so that we don't come to conflict. Some conflict is good conflict if it's righteous and your heart is in a good place. But we can avoid a whole lot of persecution by becoming a milquetoast, spineless church that doesn't stand for anything. And on a long enough timeline, many churches choose that path. This is an example of Jesus reminding the churches, stand firm. Set your feet and stand firm. In love, but stand for truth, because that is love.
All right, so we're going to move on after that. One thing I would like to say specifically is whenever he addresses the church at Pergamum, he says, some of you. It's not all of you. It is some of you. It is just a reference to just a little bit of leaven can make the whole batch rise. So it's not that the whole church was behaving that way, but it got its foothold in there. And if you don't nip it in the bud, I think is the saying, and it can continue to grow and fester until it takes over. So another church, I think we're kind of running out of time, so we'll just quickly go through this one. Thyatira experienced very, very similar, the letter is very, very similar to Pergamum, with the difference being there's a reference to tolerating a woman named Jezebel who calls herself a prophetess. A lot of debate whether this is an individual and her name is actually Jezebel, if this is an individual and they are calling her Jezebel as a reference to Ahab's wife, King Ahab, or if it is just solely a reference to somebody is in there making trouble. Whatever it is, the fact of the matter doesn't change that someone was calling themselves a prophet and they were teaching to the Christians to worship idols, make sacrifices to idols, and commit acts of immorality, very similar to Pergamum. Here we have another instance of Christians being told, you can do this, and you can worship over here and do this, but you can do this and be a part of society. Keep your job. Things along those lines. And so, just another example of compromise. Very similar. The two churches are very similar. We're going to continue rolling on to the last topic, which is apathy. Does everybody know what apathy means? I had to Google it. I don't know big words. Indifference, yeah. So lack of interest, enthusiasm, or concern. So probably one that we all think about is Laodicea. Laodicea is called the lukewarm church. I really like this one. I was reading N.T. Wright's book on Revelation for Everyone. Really good read if you, 10 minutes, thank you. really good read if you want to dive into Revelation passage by passage. But Laodicea is, as a city as a whole, has got everything going on for them. They're one of the wealthiest cities in the region. The banking center is in that region. But for all the things that they had no good water supply. They got their warm water from hot springs to one direction, and they got cold water from mountains another direction. They came down aqueducts and all that. But by the time the water got to Laodicea, it was neither hot, it was neither cold. It was lukewarm. So a lot of people say, whenever he says, you are neither hot nor cold for me, but you are lukewarm, people take that to mean you need to be hot for Jesus or you need to be an atheist. Either be all for me or be all against me. That is not the case. Both hot water and cold water are pleasing, and that is what the reference is, that hot water, a nice hot bath, is really awesome. Hot water is good for cooking, it's good for health and healing. Cold water is great whenever you've worked hard and you need just a nice cup of water, okay? They both have their value, but water that is lukewarm in the middle is disgusting. Nobody has come in from working outside all day in the middle of August in Houston and said, I want a room temperature glass of water. No one has ever said that. Probably better than nothing, but a lot of people don't say that. So the point is that Laodicea's offerings in their worship leave something wanting. They are neither hot nor cold for God. They could be worshiping, they could be participating in services, not participating in society, but their heart is not there. They are apathetic, they have a lack of interest or a lack of enthusiasm or concern. One thing that's particularly noted about Laodicea is that the Christians here in the city themselves was actually very, very successful. The city had tons and tons of imports. They had riches, clothes, good medicine. But because they were so rich, Jesus, in the letter, John, God's words, said, even though you're so rich, you are poor, blind, and naked. Complete opposite of what they experienced in their day-to-day life. And he says that they needed the gold that only Jesus can give. There was and I think that in their case, that Laodicea had a tradition of fending for themselves and taking care of themselves. And over years of success in that, they no longer felt they needed God to provide for them. So we're going to move on because I want to get to the very last thing. Sardis, the spiritually dead church. I believe that is kind of right in line with the term apathy. And what's interesting is they had a reputation for being alive, but had fallen asleep. So what does that mean to us? Reputation is not everything. We cannot live on our reputation. People can say everything they want about Bel Air, that is a great congregation, go worship with them, but if someone shows up and they don't have the same experience because it was their grandparent telling them that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, your reputation doesn't matter. And this one specifically I think is really important. I just want to hit on this and then we will move on to the final question, is that in the letter, it says, I will come like a thief in the night. How many people have heard that saying? A couple people, okay. So nobody read, is what you're telling me. So he says, I will come like a thief in the night. And that is often used to explain Jesus' second coming. While that can be said about Jesus' second coming, in this letter specifically, it is not referring to the second coming of Jesus. What could it be referring to? It could be referring to the judgment coming to the church. It could be discipline, or it could be a hard time that's coming to the church. Why does this passage specifically, why is it impactful for Sardis? Well, Sardis was considered a town that nobody could attack. They were well positioned, had a cliff on one side, a hill on the other. Many people had tried, never successful. The Persians, in the middle of the night, scaled the sheer wall, infiltrated the city, and overtook it. So specifically, I will come like a thief in the night had an impact on them. in the sense that they were not prepared for that. They thought they were invulnerable. They thought that they would just continue going. As Christians, we can have that thought, right? Nothing's going to get to me. I'm good. I read my Bible. I go to church. I don't say bad words. Go on the laundry list of things that pat yourself on the back about. But the fact of the matter is anything can come like a thief in the night, whether it's persecution, whether it's judgment or trials, or yes, the Lord can come like a thief in the night. Lastly, I also think that Ephesus falls into this church. It's considered the levelless church. What's interesting is they are praised for rooting out false teaching. They are so good about finding false teachers and making sure that they are so set in what the doctrine says. But they are rebuked for having left their first love. Quickly, in 10 words or less, if that's possible, what does anyone think that means that they have left their first love? No one? Okay. The answer is not a lot of people know. That's why I wanted someone else to say instead of me. But just think about what that could be. All right, you don't have to say it out loud, but they are so dedicated in rooting out evil. But are they forgetting to love? Are they forgetting to love one another? Are they forgetting to love others, just as Jesus loved everybody? Are they forgetting that they're so obsessed with saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, that they're not coming and they're not worshiping, they're not lifting their voice in praise to God, they're not praying to God? Just a couple thoughts, but we'll continue on to the last, which Rick hit this like in the first 10 minutes. That one actually clicked every way through. So 2 questions I present to you. First one is, where do you see the congregation of Bel Air? If we got a letter today, what would be in that letter? You can say it out loud. You don't have to. I will tell you what I think the biggest risk for Christians today is. Now, we've talked about this already, but I particularly think today, if we're thinking specifically, that being apathetic is probably one of the things that can happen to us the easiest, whether individually or as a congregation. I think that you can get set in your ways and set in doing things and coming, filling a pew. Oh, I'm tired. I had a long work day. I can live stream. Live stream is a great tool, but there are ways with technology, with society, with things being scheduled on Sundays and Wednesdays. Growing up, I remember that I did not participate in a soccer league because they had games on Sundays. Okay, now we have all sorts of leagues, all sorts of things that have gatherings on Sundays and Wednesdays, school events on Wednesday nights. That was not the norm when I was younger, but is becoming more and more the norm. I think a lot of these things can get tied up together, but if you allow the world to choose and dictate what you do over what the Bible does, then you can be compromised, apathy. I think that personally. I think that could be a big danger for each individual. I think it could be a danger for the congregation as well. Anybody have comments in the last couple minutes on what do you think is a risk? Your own opinion. And like I said, Rick, you already mentioned this earlier on about persecution. Ian, you've talked about it a couple times. David, you've talked about it. Any other thoughts on these 3, persecution, compromise, apathy? How you see them in your life today, how you see them in Bel Air's life? Robert had his hand up. And did you have your hand up?
Just real quick, on the persecution front, as we were talking through that, I kept thinking about the 2 things. One is the obvious, in your face, active, and then the other is the passive. And the passive, I think, leads to compromise because it's insidious and you don't actually see it coming. It just kind of creeps in, and then all of a sudden you look back, you're like, how did I stray so far from the truth?
Mm-hmm. Ian, you had your hand up, right?
Yeah, I'll just say real quick in terms of the Church of Ephesus, kind of losing their first love. I think that's a reference to the covenant relationship we're supposed to have with Christ and how that's in reference to like a marriage the covenant of marriage. And the church in Ephesus, and even us now, today, we can become apathetic because just like when you're married for a while, you kind of lose that euphoria of that excitement of being in love. And we should be asking ourselves, do we have that same excitement for our relationship with Christ?
Anybody else want to make a comment? Okay. Well, I have good news. I don't know what the title for next Wednesday's class is, but the good news is Daniel will be back. So anything you didn't want to ask me because you knew I don't know the answer, you can ask Daniel.